Hey folks, Michael Mann from Michael Mann Security Services. Welcome to our webinar on site emergency plans. Always an interesting topic. How do you write a site emergency plan for your church or your ministry? So before we get started, here's how you contact us. All right, website michaelmannsecurityservices.com, or you can call us at 615-606-1006. You can get us at email at scottm, SCOTTM, at michaelmannsecurityservices.com, or you can get us on Facebook or Instagram at Safe with Man. Thanks for tuning in. Let's talk about what's going to happen here very quickly. So we're going to talk about 25, 30 minutes. I'm going to walk you through a very simple process for developing a site emergency plan for your church or ministry. Now, this is not, I make it as simple as I can here. But understand this can take time, and this is going to take some resources. So, but again, this is not something you can't do. This is the way you do it for a church. This is the way you do it for a chemical site. This is the way you do it for a nuclear site or any other location that needs a site emergency plan. All right, so I'm going to break it down as simple as possible. The purpose is to assist churches with addressing the development of their site emergency plans. Again, I get a lot of questions around this, and I see things, and I ask questions, why are you doing it that way? And what I figured out is just, look, you guys have never done it, so I'll walk you through the process, what it looks like. Take notes. So what's going to happen at the end of this is I'll open it up for Q&A. If you have questions or you're taking notes, send those into the Facebook page now. So Scott is there looking for messages or looking for questions. He's going to write those questions down with your name, and at the end of this presentation, if we have any, then I'll go through the Q&A. Scott will read the questions to me, I'll read back, and then I'll give you an answer. So don't forget, write them down if you've got them, and then at the end of this, Scott's going to give them to me, okay? All right, so sometimes we call this a problem statement. Really what I call this is an opportunity or opportunity. So first opportunity. Effective methods for asset protection and emergency management in the church are very unique. Okay, so this development of this plan kind of requires some creativity. Now, what this means is, and I'll go over this, probably going on Google. We'll talk about this in a few minutes. Google's not your friend with this. So, borrowing a site emergency plan from someone else and trying to fit that into your church is probably not going to work. You're going to have to develop your plan based around the assets you're trying to protect, the threats or the hazards or the emergencies that you've identified, and those very specific response protocols. So again, this is something you're going to have to design yourself. It's going to be very difficult for you to Google something, take somebody else's plan, and just cut and paste or use that. Okay? This is something you're going to have to, again, you guys have to create it for it to work and for it to be effective. Church security functions are primarily managed and conducted by volunteers. That's with anything we talk about here. So most of the folks doing this aren't getting paid. They're doing this because they have servants' hearts. And so they do this on their own time. Maybe they've never done this before, so it's something that church leadership, and of course if you're managing a church security team or this function, you have to remember these are volunteers, not getting paid, and they probably never done anything like this before. And of course, churches have limited resources, and so it's not like most churches can go out and they can hire someone to write their site emergency plan, because a lot of times it's time consuming, and it would eat up a lot of the resources that the church has, very specifically for your security or safety element. Okay? So it's just some things to think about very specifically as we go through this presentation. Okay, so let's knock this out real quick, because some of you guys may be asking this, what in the world is a site emergency plan? So very, very simple. It's the church's policies and procedures for dealing with an emergency situation on site. So there's an emergency on site. How are you guys going to deal with that at your church? That's all a site emergency plan is. So some things to think about with this. So we're talking about an asset-based model. So let me explain what that means. The focus, or you are focused on when the critical assets are present. So a critical asset is any asset where compromise creates an unacceptable risk for you and for the church. And most of the time what that means is that's the people. You're trying to protect the congregation, the visitors, the staff members. So if they're compromised, that creates an unacceptable risk. So when we talk about an asset-based model, what I mean by that is when you're standing post on Sunday, when most of the assets are there, or Wednesday, or whenever you guys have services, you're going to have an asset-based site emergency plan. This is through my experience. This is what works best, or what seems to have worked best based on what we've done and what I've done for other churches and ministries. So you might have an asset-based site emergency plan for your guys or your volunteers on Sunday that are going to deal with emergencies. Now, if you come from a large church or a church that has a staff on site during the week of 5, 10, 15, 20 people, they might have a site emergency plan to deal with during the week when you're not there, and when 500 people aren't on site, they might have a separate plan that deals with their site emergencies or the emergency that happens to the church when the critical assets are not there. We're talking about the congregation. And don't get me wrong, not that the staff during the week, if you've got that, isn't critical. It's just their actions are going to be very different than yours, okay? So you might have two different plans. This is why this is important for the site security teams or for the church volunteer safety or security teams, whatever you call yourselves. One, this is your plan. This is what you and your team are going to do. And so, again, the staff is going to do something different during the week. So you manage this operational plan, and if you've got a staff during the week, or the church has a staff during the week, they have an administrative plan that they manage, okay? Plan activation and incident mitigation and response is managed by the security team. So if you have an operational plan, when you are there on site, you, the security team or safety team, manage that plan and that response. It is your responsibility if you choose to do that. Now, I don't know who else would do it, especially on Sunday or Wednesday nights or whenever you have services. So you're in the position to manage this because it's safety, and a big part of security obviously is safety. So the site security team or the site safety team manages this process, this operational plan that deals with the critical assets that are on site during services. Okay? Hope that makes sense. All right, so you separate the two. This is going to make this easier for you guys as you develop this plan that you guys are going to manage if you separate it. Okay? Again, if you've seen videos or you've seen some other stuff from us, I manage security for a pretty large church. We've got about 1,700 folks we run through there on Sunday, 1,700 or so depending on the Sunday. And then we have another campus on the other side of the county that has about 550 people that run through like 2 services. And so pretty good sized property at the Brentwood campus. And so that's a lot of folks, a lot of people there. And so what's worked for us is looking at this operational plan, and then during the week, because we have a large staff there during the week, there's an administrative plan. All right? And again, we manage this. On Sundays or whenever we have services or special events, we manage it. Okay? So here's where your questions are going to come in. Here are the basic steps. I'm going to walk you through it. Okay? All right. So first, don't overcomplicate the process. Don't make this any harder than it really is. So number one, we talked about this. The plan for your workplace probably won't work well for your church. So a mistake that I do see is I'll go in to talk to a church, and when I'm talking about security, site emergency plans, some people call them crisis response plans or crisis management plans, but someone will come up and they'll start talking about it, and I'll see like a big Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of data on it, or somebody will come up and say, hey, I work at so-and-so manufacturing, and they'll pick up something that looks like 2 Old Testaments, and they'll say, look, I'm gonna borrow this, and this is how we're going to create our site emergency plan. That's probably not going to work. So it's probably not going to work for the church. All right. So remember, when we start to borrow plans from other types of industries or locations, they have different resources, they have different regulatory requirements, and so it's a very different monster when we're creating something for a church as opposed to a manufacturing site or a corporate center. Okay, I said this before: Google is not your friend. So if you Google church site emergency plan, you're going to see stuff that FEMA's put out there, which is even that is way too complicated for a church, for most churches. You're going to get all kinds of stuff, and it's going to send you down 5 or 6 different rabbit holes. So don't do that. Write down this process, and if you have any questions, all you have to do is email us, and we'll answer those questions to the best of our ability if you're going through the process of this. So don't overcomplicate this process. So keep this thing basic, and I'm going to walk you through this here as we go through the steps. What can happen? All right, number 1. Number 2, what does response from the safety team look like if this happens, or whatever emergencies occur, and what's the process for response. So what can happen, what's response look like, what's that process for response, and we're going to go through that in the next couple slides. So don't overcomplicate this thing. Don't Google stuff. Don't let your cousin come home and say, hey, look, I work at the car factory and here's our site emergency plan. It's this big. That's not going to work to copy or Google or cut and paste. It's just not going to work for the church, okay? All right, identify internal resources and capabilities. And this is hard for leaders sometimes. So if you're managing your church security element or your team or safety team, go out and look for resources in the church. And here's some folks that can help you, okay? Go out and look for a certified safety professional or a CSP. So what a CSP is that's somebody that's been doing safety for a long time. And a lot of safety professionals deal with site emergency plans or crisis management plans. A lot of CSPs actually write those plans for different companies or organizations. So they understand the process. They know how to go through to do assessments. They know how to create the plans or response protocols. They can help you identify hazards or emergencies. So go to your church or your congregation and see if there's a certified CSP. Go out and ask if there's an environmental health and safety manager or environmental health and safety engineer at the church. A lot of times you'll find a CSP might be an EH&S manager or engineer. Environmental health and safety are the folks that manage safety and other processes in other industries that deal with safety. Now again, or with security. Now again, you don't want them to give you their plan at the manufacturing site, but they can sit down with you and help you through that assessment process because more than likely they've either done this before or as part of their job description, they manage site emergency plans, okay? Medical professional. So it doesn't have to be a doctor. If you've got a paramedic, you've got an EMT, you've got firefighters, go to them. They can help you create your response protocols for medical emergencies. We'll talk about that. So what does that look like? It's one thing to go through CPR training, but how do you put that into a site emergency plan? And the firefighters, the paramedics, the nurses, and even the doctors may be able to help you do that. And of course, again, we've talked about this. We just mentioned it, first responders. They can kind of maybe help you break this down to tell you what this looks like in a protocol. Not all the protocols, but like maybe how to respond to CPR. One thing to take the class, but it's another thing if you've got to write this down and teach other people how to do it. All right? Identify regulations and training requirements. Okay, so understand, so OSHA, Occupational Safe and Healthy or Health Administration does not, to my knowledge, they did not, but does not regulate churches when it comes to worship services. Now, anything outside of a worship service or something that's not considered a worship service that happens at a church, they will regulate, but during your worship services, OSHA doesn't have anything or any kind of requirements for something specific when there's worship. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that with your site emergency plan when we're talking about OSHA regulations or requirements very specifically for worship services. But there may be some municipal codes, there may be some state codes that you have to pay attention to as you start to write this. So go into your state, local, and municipal laws and codes and make sure that there's not anything that you need to be addressing. Every state, every municipality is different. So we're in just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, in Brentwood. So something that we do here is going to be different, maybe in Connecticut. Okay, so take a look at those laws. Emergency response. What does your Good Samaritan law say? What does your law say about CPR, AED, and first aid? Like, who can do that? Do you have to be certified to do that? So go into when you start looking at emergency response protocols, go into laws about that or read that, very specifically Good Samaritan, and make sure that, if somebody's not certified and they're on your team and they go and they help somebody with CPR or using an AED, do they have to be certified to do that? So check on those things, those regulations and training requirements as you go through your plan. So make sure that you're following the law like we should. Okay, so the next step is going to identify your threat categories or your emergencies. Okay? Just generally, there are three categories of threats or emergencies. And I'm going to give you definitions for each. Intentional, unintentional, and natural. Okay? So the intentional emergency or threat is going to be like your active shooter. It's going to be like a crime in progress. It could be a domestic incident. It could be like a missing child where there's a child custody issue. If you're going to address those issues in your site emergency plan, that is an intentional threat or like an intentional emergency, okay? The second category is unintentional. That's going to be things like medical emergencies. Unintentional is generally things that we don't plan for, or we can't plan for them. So that could be a medical emergency. It could be a slip, trip, and fall. So the pastor goes to walk up to the stage or the pulpit to give his sermon. The worship team or the setup team didn't do what they were supposed to. There's a cable laying there. The pastor trips over it, falls off the stage, injures himself. That is an unintentional injury. So slips, trips, and falls, medical emergencies, heart attacks, whatever, that is an unintentional injury or threat category. And then you have natural. That's going to be weather-related stuff most of the time. So we're talking about tornadoes, floods, or any kind of severe weather or any kind of event that's naturally occurring. So these are the threat categories or emergencies that you should look at and start to identify in your site emergency plan. And there's a number of subcategories in each of these categories. All right? So identify your threat or emergency categories. Okay? Now, here's what I want you to, we're going to get into this later in the presentation. You need to make the plan relevant to the church. And so understand we're all worried about those intentional acts, the active shooter. That's a big thing for churches. But I want you to understand when we start talking about probability for emergencies and what you really should be preparing for, and not that you shouldn't prepare for the active shooter, but this is straight from the CDC. And with everything going on right now, with the craziness in this country, like you're locked in your house right now, and some states you think you can't leave. Okay? So with all this craziness and everybody paying attention to the CDC, here's what the CDC has to say about deaths or the leading causes of death in the United States of America. Number one is heart disease. We lose almost 700,000 people a year to heart disease. So it's more likely that somebody's going to have a heart attack at your church than an active shooter coming in. The next is cancer or cancer-related illnesses. So the next leading cause of death in the United States of America is cancer. And then this is why I always mention slips, trips, and falls. The next most likely threat category for your unintentional threats or emergencies are going to be accidents. People slip, trip, and fall. They get out of their car on the ice and they slip. They bust their head open. They break their leg, their hip, whatever. It happens. These are the things that you're going to be probably most concerned about. These are the things that you're probably going to have to deal with. I've been managing a big security element or safety element for a large church for 5 years, and I will tell you, no active shooters, very few intentional threats or emergencies. We have dealt with people fainting. We've dealt with cancer-related illnesses, and we've dealt with people tripping and falling. That's what we deal with most of the time. None of that requires guns, doesn't require intermediate weapons. It just requires a response and somebody knowing how on the other end of that response what to do. Okay? So when you start to look at how we do this, so go conduct an assessment. Identify what emergencies may occur. And here's how you do this process. So you're not just trying to borrow somebody's plan. Here's a basic way to look at this. So first, what are the hazards on your site? And this is something we don't think of. If you have a playground on your church, that's a site hazard. Okay? A playground can be a site hazard at your church. Where are areas that are not lit very well? That can be a hazard. Things can happen in those areas of that property. If you've got an old barn or old building and you've got animals underneath those like wildlife, that is a hazard. Those are things that could cause a problem. So identify the site hazards that are on your property and then walk through in your mind or with the team and figure out what kind of an emergency could that hazard cause. Okay? What's my exposure? Next, the congregation. What does your congregation look like? So look, if you're a young church and the average age is 30, then you're probably not going to have to worry a lot about heart disease. But if the age of your congregation is 60 plus, you might want to know where the AED is, and everybody probably needs to be certified on CPR. Okay? And maybe they need to know what a stroke looks like. So what does the congregation look like? And if it's a mix, if you've got everything from a 2-day-old all the way up to somebody that's 86 years old, then you've got a number of emergencies that you might have to think about dealing with or responding to. Okay? The surrounding area around the church. This is an assessment. What is happening at the surrounding area? What does crime look like? What are the hazards in that surrounding area? What is going on right outside of the church at the building across the street? The crime rate, And you can go to your law enforcement and your emergency professionals, your emergency responders, your firefighters, your paramedics, your police officers, your deputy sheriffs. They can help you with this. What's happening around your area? Because you need to know that, because that's going to, or it can bleed over onto the church. Site history, what have you had to deal with, or what has the church had to deal with in the last 2 years? So more than likely in the last 2 years, especially if you're a big congregation, if you look, even if your safety team is brand new, if you ask questions, there's probably been at least one medical emergency, and there's probably been at least one slip, trip, and fall. Okay? So again, how do we go through this to the assessment? What are the site hazards? Identify them. What kind of emergencies can those hazards cause? What's the congregation look like? What kind of problem can they bring in as they come in every Sunday? What's the surrounding area? What's going on around the surrounding area? Probably within a 1 to 2 mile radius around the church is what I'm looking for. And then what has happened on site, or what is the frequency over the last 2 years? Heart attacks, slips, trips, and falls, injuries, whatever. Okay? All right. The security team owns the process. We've already talked about this. Asset-based approach when critical assets are on site. So we're talking about worship services, special events. If the site security or safety team is on site, then your operational site emergency plan is under activation, and you manage and own this process. Okay? The site security or safety team identifies the hazard. They respond to the emergency. So you guys own this process. All right. When you develop emergency response protocols, remember the 3 R's. Number 1, it has to be relevant. What that means, it's got to meet the needs of the church. I go back to Google is not your friend, and your cousin that works at the manufacturing site that was willing to borrow his site emergency plan and give it to you, that's probably not going to work because it's probably not relevant to the church. So make sure the threats that you identify are the emergencies, and your response protocols are relevant to the needs of the church. Number 2, realistic. Can they be accomplished based on the resources? So if you write a response protocol, can your safety and security team respond to it? And number 2, you have the resources to do it. So an example is going to be AEDs. So if you don't have the budget for an AED because they're expensive and all you can do is CPR, then what that means is, because again, if somebody goes into cardiac arrest, CPR is probably not going to get the heart, or it won't get the heart started back. It's just getting oxygen to the brain to minimize the amount of brain damage or the possibility of brain damage. You're waiting on EMS to get there. So what this means is, to be realistic, if I don't have an AED, what I really need to have is an enhanced 911 protocol to get the EMS there quicker because I don't have an AED. So make sure that whatever your response protocols are, they're going to be realistic to what you guys can do. All right? And then, of course, they have to be retainable. This is the most important part, I think, of the site emergency plan. This is why your plan can't be this thick. Whatever your site or safety team is going to have to do, whatever those response protocols are, they have to remember how to do it. They're not going to have time to pick that book up and look at it when they're having to run to a medical emergency inside the sanctuary, or when they're running to some natural event outside. Okay? So they're not going to have time to look up the protocol. They're going to have to know how to do it. So don't overcomplicate it. Provide the necessary training. And if you have to, make this a bullet point template or platform. Don't make it complicated. They have to be able to retain this and remember what this looks like. And we'll go over how you do that. All right? Share the plan with church leadership. Okay, so number 1, get approval. Like, take this to the leadership and say, look, we've created this plan. It is an operational plan. Look, this may be different than what happens during the week when we're not here. Take a look at this and tell us what you think about it, because the church needs to approve it. 2, share and communicate the plan to all the stakeholders. So, like, let the pastor know what this looks like. Let the leadership know what it looks like. Let the elders know. You want to get feedback from them, because something that you believe might be the right protocol, maybe that doesn't work for all the ministries. Maybe somebody sees a vulnerability in this, and you want to get that feedback from those stakeholders so you can make the necessary corrections so this is an effective plan. And look, let's say a fire alarm goes off, and it's in the sanctuary. Like, your pastor might be the person that says, hey, the fire alarm's going off. Security's opening the doors. You guys get out of here. So your pastor or some of these stakeholders can help get this response through or get it working. Okay? Receive that valuable feedback. We talked about that. We talked about this. Getting feedback is never a bad thing. When I get feedback, when I receive it, that's just a way for me to improve the plan that we've got in place. Emergency communication protocols, again, you want the leadership and the stakeholders to see this. What does that look like? Again, is this going to be something that the team can retain? But I need them to know what those protocols are going to look like. I need the stakeholders to sign off on it. Okay? All right, so here's how we measure the plan's effectiveness. So, and this doesn't take 2 hours at a time. You need to exercise the plan. You need to validate the plan. Here's how we do this, okay? So there are different types of exercises. There's orientation, table talk, walkthrough, and there's a drill. So here's how this works. You've created a protocol, and now what you want to do when the protocols have been created is you want to do an orientation first. And what that means is, look, this takes like 10 minutes. So take one a month or one every 2 weeks or whatever. I hear from church security teams all the time, hey, we don't have the resources you guys have. So we don't have a whole lot to cover when it comes to church security because we don't have a lot of money. Guys, if you've got a site emergency plan, about a quarter of the year can be covered in training with doing these exercises. So an orientation is first time you're reading through the emergency response protocol. So example, it's like, somebody goes into cardiac arrest and you're going to read the process or the emergency protocol for cardiac arrest. What does this person on this post do? Read through it. Make sure they understand it, okay? Later on, instead of an orientation, then that protocol can become a review because you've already read this to them once. The next thing we do after you orientate them on whatever the procedure is, you have a tabletop. Now, a tabletop exercise is not what you think it is, all right? All a tabletop is you get in a table, there's a moderator, which kind of creates a scenario. Everybody gets around that moderator, and you create a scenario. And the folks that are in the scenario themselves, the participants, you'll give them the emergency response or you'll give them the scenario, and they will talk through what it is they're supposed to do. And this is not pass or fail. And again, this takes 15 minutes, okay? So a tabletop is not pass or fail. Everybody gets around a table or they sit in a circle. A moderator comes up with a scenario, and then people walk through that process. They talk about it. And the cool thing about a tabletop is there's no pressure, and at the end of that you can get lessons learned and you can talk about what you need to change. You'll identify that in tabletop. Walkthrough, that is after the tabletop, you'll take that protocol and you guys will physically go to a post and you'll walk through a process. Hey, you're Romeo 1. That's your post today. Somebody falls out or somebody faints in the sanctuary. You see it. What is it you do? Walk me through that process. And that responder walks you through that process. And of course, this is after you've done orientation and then a tabletop. Then you have a drill. Most of these, because this is an operational plan, it's asset-based, you probably won't have congregants on scene when you're doing the drill, but you can bring other ministries in to help, and you guys can go through like a role-playing exercise where you have an actual drill, okay? What we do through this, again, this is not pass or fail. I want to know the lessons learned, number one, and number two, we want to figure out what the purpose is, and again, it's an assessment. Quick story, I've developed some comprehensive armed response protocols, or actually programs, physical security programs, for some private Christian schools. One of the schools I put a response program in. Later on, they Googled a site emergency plan. And so they put a site emergency plan in because the school wanted it. There was some resources that were not there. And so they never really walked through an orientation, a tabletop, or walkthrough. So they would do a drill because they had to have a drill quarterly. Well, just because of a lack of resources and really a lack of interest from the teachers, they never went through the first 3 steps. And so the security lead there would set up a drill. He would share that with trusted individuals, and somehow by lunchtime, every teacher in the entire school knew that they were going to have a drill that day. And they were freaked out the rest of the day. He would get emails from teachers. This is not fair. We don't want to have to do this. We hate when you do this. And 2 things would happen. They would either water the drill down so bad it wasn't effective, or 2, he would have to cancel it. And so this is why you want to go through this process, and this is not a comprehensive process. You're walking through, you tabletop it, or you orient or you read it, you tabletop it, you walk it, and then you actually have the drill. Okay? It's not a pass or fail. You're trying to assess and you're trying to get lessons learned out of it. Okay? Continuous improvement. After all this is over, it's been approved, it's in place, you start running these drills and exercises, you get after action reviews and reports. So look at the incidents or look at the drills and exercises. What did you learn? What do you need to change? Document what you learned on the drills and exercises or the things that actually happened. How did the responders respond during the medical emergency if it was a medical emergency? Did they do what they were supposed to? Did somebody call 911? Walk through the process and document what you learned. Update your response protocols. Look, when you go through CPR training, about every 3 or 4 years, something changes on CPR training and certification. You might have to go in and change that and update that in your protocols. So keep that up to date and update your training requirements. Like if you've got some sort of requirement that's good for 2 years, make sure your responders update all those training requirements and go back through what they have to go back through to get that certification. We don't want the certifications to lapse. Okay? All right. That's it. I told you 30 minutes. We're right at it. Do we have any questions? Nothing? All right, folks. Here's how you get a hold of us. If you've got some questions after this, you can email us. Go to our website, michaelmannsecurityservices.com. You can call Scott. He'll answer anytime because he loves to answer the phone after midnight, 615-606-1006. You can email Scott at scottm, S-C-O-T-T-M, at michaelmannsecurityservices.com. Or you can get us at Facebook or Instagram at Safe with Man, where you are right now. If you're tuning into us live on Facebook, shoot us a question. It'll pop up. We'll see it. We usually answer within the hour. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope that you're enjoying your quarantine. If that's where you are, locked in with your family, you probably need a haircut. You're probably eating leftovers. We're sorry. We hope this is over soon. Thanks for joining us again. We really appreciate it. Hey, shoot us some feedback. Let us know what you thought about this. All right? And remember, folks, it's about prevention, not response.